Hello and welcome back to our conversation between Aston history and Aston photonics. I'm with Professor Andrew Ellis and with Professor Vladek Forysiak and with Dr Ilaria Scaglia.
Hello again.
During our break, we were talking briefly about the issue of data and the environment. And so just before we move on to talking about solutions, positive ways forward, should we just dwell on this? There is a common assumption here that the digital path is always the more sustainable path, but it's not quite that simple, is it?
It's not very simple at all. We can see here a data center. Data centers these days are huge. This is a small corner of a data center in CERN. The amount of heat they generate is such that they actually have temperature-controlled corridors for the engineers to work in, rather than temperature controlling the entire data center. So the amount of energy that these data centers use is immense. And the largest data center in the world at the moment is something like 400 meters by 500 meters. The specifications allow for a kilometer square data center. So these are massive structures with huge energy consumption. But the positive thing is, when we displace activities to data centers that are using a lot of energy, we could be displacing a lot more energy than the data center is using. For example, in the first global lockdown in response to the COVID crisis, an American observatory noticed that there was a 30% reduction in atmospheric CO2 over the first 3 months of the lockdown. So shifting activity from whatever we were doing pre-pandemic to what we were doing during that first lockdown reduced atmospheric CO2. And so that should have an impact on the climate and energy consumption overall. So it's a very fascinating field to look at.
Yeah. Vladek, what do you make of this digital versus sustainability dilemma?
Oh, it is a dilemma indeed. I was going to reflect on digital offers so many positive attributes. Amongst them are convenience, flexibility. So when I think of digital functions taking place, for example, in an optical fiber communication system, as these systems have evolved, as the technology of these systems have evolved, we've moved towards, as mentioned earlier, and they rely heavily on digital signal processing chips, which consume a lot of energy. If you go back to the early days of optical fiber communications, before those chips were available, we had instead a way of compensating for the dispersion which causes a signal to spread in a fiber, and that needs to currently that's taken care of by these digital signal processing chips. We were able to do that simply in glass by having a fiber with the opposite type of physical parameters, and that had the ability to do that compensation frozen in. So it's not very flexible. It had a particular length, it was frozen in. As we've moved to this very convenient way technology, one chip can take care of whatever length of system that you have. However, it comes with a price, and that price is this energy, the energy that it consumes. So there are ways we can learn from technology history, looking back at the way we used to do things, perhaps a little bit less convenient, but may offer us a way forward which can consume less energy, if perhaps at the price of slightly less flexibility.
We're back again at this dilemma of ends and means, aren't we? So which means we take are going to be determined to some extent by the ends that we've decided are the most important. Ilaria, what's the historical perspective on this dilemma?
Well, historically, human beings have shown a certain propensity to falling in love. They become enamored very easily. It's a human need, right? To become charmed, to fall for something new, for something reassuring, for something comforting. I do history of emotions. That's one of the things that we study in the history of technology. Human beings seems to be desperate for comfort, to feel things are going to be all right. They're going to be better. The other propensity, I'm afraid, is that human beings like to be righteous. They like to feel they're right. They're doing something better. Now, there's something good about being righteous, right? That means trying to be right. And sometimes they're righteous about really good things. But the bad thing about being righteous is that it confines human beings into a corner in not wanting to see the other side. To me, the lesson of this photograph, and especially of having two specialists here to help us to understand it, is that it's very easy to fall into the easy temptation of becoming righteous and to say, no, the best way was the old way and everything is how it should be, and to be a Luddite. Or on the other hand, to say, oh, look, the digital, this is so much more sustainable, and to criminalize anyone who even ask a question about, is this really a good idea? And instead, perhaps a lesson from history could be to learn how to be a tad more honest, perhaps a bit less enamored for a moment, a bit less righteous, and to accept that it might take a full paragraph to really understand the whole situation. It's a question of trying to assess, to balance different things. Are we better off having how many thousands of people connecting from home, and then they're using the electricity in the data center, and then we need to cool it, or for the same people to drive? What if they took an electric train instead? What if they biked? These are long, complex discussions. They probably are going to have different answers depending on where those people are.
Well,
so that's the kind of perspective that I think history can offer. But we need this kind of expertise to have the conversation.
A few people have been saying for a while, we need a world that thinks in paragraphs rather than the world that thinks in sound bites. Let's come to some of the good news stories here, which photonics is the bearer of. What are the solutions to some of the issues that you've been raising? Then there's in which direction does the future lie for photonics?
Shall I start?
Of course. Yeah.
So rather than a direction, perhaps I want to say something about an opportunity that photonics offers. So if we go right back to our first conversation, Andrew pointed out how photonics is a brilliant technology for transporting data. So for moving a light signal right across the Atlantic Ocean, 6,000 kilometers, without that optical light signal having to be received and regenerated at an intermediate amplifier, or so-called regenerator. It's brilliant for this. Most of the processing at the edge of the network takes place in electronics, and there's very good reason for that. Fundamentally, electrons are interactive, photons are less so, bosons, fermions. There are, however, new opportunities coming along where photonics may penetrate further into the processing part, therefore alleviating some of these energy requirements that are driven by the electronics. So maybe an optical coprocessor taking some of the load off the DSP behind it by performing some element of that. So photonics is a really new, emerging key enabling technology, we call it, but an emerging technology which offers a lot of promise. And we're increasingly able to integrate more and more functions onto the equivalent photonic chips to the electronic chips. They're nowhere near, orders of magnitude below, lower in complexity. However, that's a promising area going forward.
How close would these sorts of developments be to commercialization? Are we thinking in terms of months, years?
I think we're really thinking years down the line. This is relatively early. I mean, increasingly we're seeing more and more functions integrating onto photonic chips, so that you can get more complicated modulators, which allow us to, in the early days, we were only able to control the amplitude of light. Now we can control lots of other things, the amplitude, the phase, the polarization. That is now standard commercially available. That wasn't available 20 years ago. And we'll be able to integrate more and more of those onto a single chip. That drives down the cost, and it drives down the energy. So I think integrated photonics are a really promising area going forward.
So there's lots more to be discovered here about the potential for the photonic technologies. Andrew, what's your own perspective on this? Do you see some hope for the kind of technical solutions that you were indicating really need to be found?
Well, I do, and my mind was drawn to the previous image of the data center, where typically you would have lots and lots of electronic switches. And already today, they're starting to bring that photonics that Vladek was talking about a lot closer to the electronic switches. So they're having on-off key, just looking at the intensity optics co-packaged on the same motherboard as the electronics. Last generation thing, you had a little plug-in with your optics in, you pushed it into the little container, and you had wires going through. Now they're actually soldering the photonic chips onto the electronic chips. The next stage from that, either the next generation or the generation after that, will be to go to this so-called coherent technology, which needs less energy, about 10 dBs, an order of magnitude less energy, gives you more bandwidth because you have the phase, there's a factor of 2, and the polarization's another factor of 2, so you've got 4 times the bandwidth as well. So that offers some great prospects to reduce that dominant energy consumption by maybe as much as an order of magnitude overall. So that's really promising. And then you can start looking at what Vladek was talking about actually putting some of that optics onto the chip rather than right next to it.
So that would help solve the capacity crunch, at least in the short to medium term.
One only ever postpones an exponential hitting the edge of the Petri dish.
Right.
But it will certainly help.
Yes. Yeah.
Another area where I think maybe encourage Andrew to comment again, where I think there's a great promise in the future opportunity. We've just seen there's huge excitement about AI, machine learning, and its applications in all sorts of areas. Digital health was one we were talking about in the break. We're beginning to see, and actually the business opportunity associated with AI and machine learning has been part of the driver of the growth of these data centers we were talking about earlier. They've been putting up, businesses like Google and so on have been putting up these data centers as fast as they can because they see the business opportunity associated with the data mining. However, right now, all the algorithms there are far from mature, far from optimized. So, and secondly, the AI and machine learning has never been really, we're just at the start of beginning to apply those techniques into the actual technology of transmission and processing as well to help us. So at the moment we can do some of these things, but we don't do them very efficiently. But given time, we'll get better and better at this. And lastly, on that context, all this stuff has come along after we've designed our initial networks. There's a lot of them out there. We can ask the question, what will networks look like if we actually, let the machines design them in some more optimal way, or help us to design them in a more optimal way? I don't know. Andrew, do you have thoughts on this?
On machines designing the networks?
Just generally on AI and ML within, or opportunities within our technology.
So my concern with AI is based on a study by a US group who looked at the energy consumption of AI. And I'd certainly agree with you that if you frame the problem correctly, AI would be capable of designing a network. But I sort of just took the numbers that the American group had done and said, well, what if I wanted a PhD thesis? And the energy consumption of AI to get the PhD thesis written was more than the entire energy consumption of a PhD student, including the calorific intake of them. And if it was one of your PhD students, Vladek, it would be good quality original material, whereas AI just goes around and it looks what's available and puts stuff together. So you get better quality stuff with less energy consumption if it's done with human intelligence, and this is at the moment, of course, rather than artificial intelligence. The difference was clearly that your PhD student takes 3 years, whereas asking the question of the AI takes 3 minutes or even quicker. So there is a convenience aspect to AI, but not necessarily in and of itself an energy consumption.
I'm going to resist the temptation to talk about human costs in that, because education itself, though, is I think it's an important topic to talk about, isn't it? As part of the way forward here, we do need a greater awareness of some of the hidden costs that we've been teasing out of these processes. Ilaria, what do you think? What's the historical perspective on that?
Well, there are a couple of thoughts that immediately spring to mind just listening to this conversation. And the first one is about, again, becoming enamored with labels right? Artificial intelligence sounds like no humans are involved and it's something completely machine-made. And I actually learned from previous chat with this gentleman and some of their colleagues that that's far from being the case. There are an awful lot of human beings involved in making it look like the machine is doing it all, and it's not quite. But that's one aspect. And I think often in education system, we can become equally enamored and just decide that, oh, of course, we can just throw it out to ChatGPT and a couple of other little devices, and then this is done, forgetting, again, the misleading nature of the label, and of course, everything else that is not happening then. If the machine with all of these humans that we don't really acknowledge is doing rather than the student themselves. And then, of course, the cost that we were talking about. That's one thing. But I think the larger historical perspective comes from the general problem of who are we doing this for? These maps we've had up throughout these talks were first of all generated by commerce. Colonialism was first of all an economic enterprise, as are many of the ventures that we've been discussing here today. But then increasingly we're talking about social issues, political issues, cultural issues. Now we're talking about education. These are civic issues. These are human issues. And so at one point, historically, people have asked the very question, what are we doing this for? Should there be a political discussion, a cultural discussion, a civic discussion?
We're back to ends and means.
And then we're back to the end and means. And so that, I think, is going to be historically the trajectory that we might see now as well, people asking those very questions.
Yeah. Can I ask, Andrew and Vladek, is there a place there for the role of history of technology, for the role of the insights of history in a technical education?
I'd say yes, there is. That how you solve the problems is important, but also the pace of the problems. One of the examples I quite often give is around the invention of the laser. The laser was invented in 1960, according to the patents, and demonstrated then. And in 1962, James Gordon wrote a review paper with 192 citations to lasers. And then my PhD students will say, it's different now, things get done quicker. Well, 192 papers in 2 years is very rapid research. So the motivation where you've got a problem and it's new and it's exciting is going to get people working hard on it. That's a good motivational lesson for students. It doesn't matter what technology you've got. You need to be excited about your problem and to get a solution developed quickly before other people come up with it. So yes, definitely. That's a trivial example, but yes, absolutely. History teaches us a lot.
Yeah. I'd like to agree with Andrew. I think not only is there a place for history, there's a place for that speculation that a knowledge of history allows you to make. So going back to our first conversation, I think I mentioned this laser in the James Bond film. That film was made in 1962, around the same time that the laser was invented. That was complete science fiction. No such thing as a laser that cut through metal at that time. And in fact, there was no such thing for 3 decades, I guess. And there is a connection here. It is the parallel developments in fiber lasers, which were invented as a consequence, I think, of the fiber communications industry, that ultimately enabled, and you might question the use of these lasers that can cut through metals, and they're dual use as well. But ultimately, it was the fiber lasers that enabled now the development of materials processing lasers. So kilowatt level lasers that can cut metal, shape metal, and unfortunately can also be used as offensive weapons or defensive weapons.
Yeah. So, Ilaria, let's reverse the equation here.
Yes.
Perhaps historians also need to know a little bit more about the technicalities too. Yes. There was a time in history of technology where the history was very much dominated by internal understanding of the technologies. Perhaps we've gone maybe too far in the opposite direction now, where we take very seriously the contexts and all the external factors, but perhaps we should be looking a little bit about the technicalities too.
Well, what I'm getting out of this conversation is that both our lots of students and ourselves could use reading of each other a bit more. You know, I can see how, as a history student, I would have benefited from learning more about the history of technology within my own discipline and technologies in the time periods I was studying. And conversely, you know, certainly I can see how people who are working in developing this material would benefit from understanding the effect that they had on people during past times. And so it was not lost on me. Just yesterday, I was reading the Robbins report, which eventually led to Aston University becoming Aston University and transforming for a college. And one of the things he called for was well-cultivated men and women. I think we should take that very seriously. Already then, in 1963 was the Robbins report, they had this sense that truly, in order to face this problem, we need people that understand the complexity, and that means doing a bit of science and a bit of history and other disciplines that might be relevant. The other aspect, though, I have to say, this is going to sound a bit grim, but I think it needs to be acknowledged. 1962, right, that you were talking about, the age of the laser, that's the midst of the Cold War. Many of these technologies have been developed historically through conflict. And, you know, we live in the time we live in, and we all watch the news, and we're very aware of the very tangible, interconnected effects the development of technologies have then on conflicts, on how conflicts developed in the past and they develop now. And conversely, how much war has, in ways that we don't often find comfortable to acknowledge, actually helped to develop our field, history and technology. And that is something that I think we've yet to come to terms with. Our own relationship, the relationship of our own disciplines with what was going on at the time and how that might have shaped our fields to become what they have. And it's not always a pretty story to read, but it's one I think we should face. And that would perhaps give us a bit more power than to shape it as we wish, or at least to look at it more honestly. And that can only be good.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much indeed for coming along to the podcast, Professor Andrew Ellis, Professor Vladek Forysiak, and Dr Ilaria Scaglia. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation about photonics and history. Do watch along with our other podcasts on the Aston Originals channel, and we'll see you again here very soon.